This is a Hope 1032 podcast.
How is that fair, God? Was a big question I had to wrestle with. Is that a lack of faith? Is that we're not praying enough? Perhaps it's set me up. That sounds probably slightly mercenary to do the sort of work that I'm doing in terms of living in the aged care space. Everybody who is in a residential care facility, everybody in that space is surrounded by death. For my first 2 years in residential care, I was 3 deaths a week was average, and I was doing a funeral every 10 days on average.
I'm Georgia, and welcome to Finding Hope, the podcast that finds the good in the midst of the bad. Each episode, we meet someone who's had a bit of a hard time but has found hope and healing along the way. And hopefully they inspire you to embrace the good in your world as well. Episode 26, Ben Boland. As you move through life, you occasionally stumble across people that floor you with their love, compassion, and care for others. Despite their own circumstances, which are often trying, they dedicate their lives to truly making the world a better place. Ben Boland is one of those people. He's an aged care chaplain who spends his days trying to make the world easier and more joyful to older Australians, especially those living with dementia. More than that, he actually shares the gospel and the love of Jesus with them as well. But Ben hasn't had an easy life. It's been one of trials and deep pain. But from deep pain also comes deep love. And I'm so excited to share a little of Ben's story today. Let's meet him.
I grew up in Tamworth. I'm the oldest of 4 children. I'm up in Stanthorpe these days, married to Beth. We've got 3 boys. In between there, I've done a science degree, a Master of Divinity, worked in the abattoirs, worked in the electronics industry. I'm a woodworker. I'd like to be a blacksmith at times. I fiddle, but I'm not very good. So big a question, and I've managed to muff it already.
I know, I love that. I love that you've lived so many, it's almost like you've lived so many different lives in one. I know that at the moment you're an aged care chaplain. You're really passionate about that. What brought you to aged care chaplaincy?
A number of things, really. When I finished uni and the science degree, and I was engaged, Beth and I looked at ministry and prayed about it and really felt that wasn't where God wanted us to be. So we did some other bits and pieces. And then I ended up being heavily involved in a Baptist church and planning some services and stuff down in Sydney. And one of the elders really strongly pushed for me to go to Bible college. I said, look, we already tried this and God said no. And he's like, I really think you should. So I'm like, okay, fine. We'll apply. And look, God, if you want us to get in and do it, make sure I get in. And if you don't want me to do it, make sure I don't get in. Nice and simple. Went for 1 year, didn't leave for 3 because I was a slow student, obviously. The plan at that stage had been mission service to China. James, our oldest, has some significant health issues which make overseas challenging, for a better phrase. I'm very comfortable in the healthcare / aged care space through other parts of life. Went and did 100 hours at what was Anglican retirement villages in Sydney as part of a subject for my 3rd year. At the end of that, they said, would you like to do the other 100 hours with us and we'll pay you? I'm like, yes, I'm a student. I'm always keen to be paid. So that was wonderful. And from there, then they offered me a job, and I've grown more passionate about it as the time has gone past.
Ben spends his days caring for society's most vulnerable. But this isn't his first foray into caregiving. His son James has had a range of health issues since infancy.
James, my wife's a midwife, so if I say it was a normal pregnancy and a normal delivery, I didn't think any of it was particularly normal, but she tells me it was, so I bowed her greater wisdom and insight. But when James was born, he was born blue, as all babies are, but they're meant to pink up, and he didn't pink up. So then stopped breathing in numerous times, so I had Beth on one bed and I had James in a trolley on the other thing. And then trying to resus him, and the doctor said, I think he's gone. And Beth had been working at that maternity unit, and the nurse or midwife told the doctor to suck it up and keep going. Then neonatal intensive care transport over to Westmead Children's Hospital, surgery mid-morning the next morning. To put it in very simple terms, his food pipe from his mouth came down and then stopped, just like a blind pouch. And the bottom half from that starts at your stomach, instead of going up and connecting up to that, came up and connected in the middle of his lungs. So he'd breathe in, and then instead of breathing the air out again, he'd breathe the air into his stomach, which doesn't help your breathing at all. So they had to do a whole pile of things. It's called, the technical term is tracheoesophageal fistula and esophageal atresia, which gets abbreviated as TOF-OA. But the challenge with that widening from the pouch and then the narrowing from where they joined it in is it functions a bit like a funnel. So food can get stuck in the top of the funnel and then blocks the little hole at the bottom. So Beth resussed him 3 times in the first 6 months. We had the ambos resuss him once. I didn't think you could make ambos turn white, but resussing a baby evidently will do that for you. So 2 pieces of major thoracic surgery, and we're probably up to about 30 pieces of day procedures.
So how is he now?
He's complicated. So he's also got eczema, allergies, and anaphylaxis, just in case you got bored. So EpiPen and all that fun germs. People will know that fame as well. He's really good. He's in high school. He looks, if you looked at him with his clothes on and you couldn't see the scar tissue, he looks like a normal child. And 98% of the time he is that normal child. The challenge is both with the anaphylaxis and the esophageal issues, he can go from normal child to in risk of dying in under a minute. So he counts as chronically ill, but he looks normal 98% of the time. It's just that 2% that gets a bit interesting.
How, during this time, especially those first few months, which I just assume would have been horrendously hard for you and your wife,
Yeah.
Was your faith rocked, challenged in that time? How did you kind of relate to God, if at all, if that even crossed your mind?
Lots of prayer. Lots of, particularly when the child's going into surgery, both for day procedures and big ones, lots of, look, God, you've given us this child, and we're the parents and we're thankful for that, but we also recognise that this child is your child and we'd like him back. But if you choose to take him home, that's your prerogative. That's not our vote, but we don't get a vote in this situation. So lots of that. Lots of just, what are we meant to do, Lord? Just weary, tired, that sort of challenge. We didn't get particularly good chaplaincy support or particularly good local church support. That was more frustrating than devastating, I think. And there's lots of things to be thankful there too. I'm thankful that my wife's a nurse midwife. That helps. If I wasn't married to her, he wouldn't be alive. So there's lots of that. And the fact that he has survived and he is doing really well is a great blessing, but it's a tough space to live in. I think the other thing, particularly when we're in Sydney and you're spending a lot of time at Westmead Children's, is you're very aware that there are lots of people who your world is boringly benign compared to what they're living through. So lots of great perspective by virtue of other people's suffering functionally.
I think that's probably enough trials for one person, but Ben is unfortunately closely acquainted with death and suffering, losing one of his childhood friends to illness as well.
The 2 funerals that I've found hardest is burying a mate from high school and burying another mate's second child who died at 3 days or something. They were both really tough funerals. So the bloke who I buried, Jonathan, his parents had gone to Bible college, basically adopted him, and then gone straight to the Middle East and spent most of or in fact all their married life with 2 adopted kids over there doing ministry stuff. When Jonathan was 16 for year 10, I think that's about right, he came and joined us in year 10 at school and struggled with all those third culture kid challenges. But got to know him and enjoyed his company and those things. Then in the midst of year 11 in the computer lab, he had an epileptic seizure, which was fine apart from he lost his licence, and that it didn't affect his normal day-to-day life. But then end of school, smallish town, Tamworth, basically everybody left town. He actually went off to do Bible college, and I went off to do a science degree. I came back 18 months, 2 years later, because I'd failed some subject and needed to find some paid employment, worked in the Abbeys for a bit, and he came home with significant health issues and spent much of that time, probably 6 months plus, in intensive care up at the hospital, and came home. When he came home eventually, basically came home very little verbal skills, needing two people to walk with him to walk, and very thin. I mean, Jonathan was my height, I'm 6 something, he was slightly taller than me, so 6'2", and came home at sort of 50 kilograms sort of stuff. So it's very light. And then, I continued doing my things and then drop in and see him when I was home in Tamworth. But eventually he died.
How do you reconcile the pain that you and your loved ones have kind of gone through with the Christian faith? Like how do you live in that tension? Because I can imagine it would be hard sometimes.
Yeah, it is hard. Pain and suffering by very nature are hard. How is that fair, God? Was a big question I had to wrestle with. What do we do with the healing stuff? You read Jesus' ministry and he seems to be always healing people and doing these miraculous get up and walk stuff. And why isn't that happening here? Is that a lack of faith? Is that we're not praying enough? And I grew up with a very mixed church heritage, so from a very Dutch Reformed theology where sort of miracles don't happen in Australia space, right through to a very Pentecostal, slain in the Spirit, the whole believe and it will be so space. So trying to wrestle with those places as a theology was really important and challenging. And I think perhaps it's set me up, that sounds probably slightly mercenary to do the sort of work that I'm doing in terms of living in the aged care space. Everybody who is in a residential care facility, everybody in that space is surrounded by death and knows that death is not simply a logical component of life, but a very real component of life. For my first 2 years in residential care, I was 3 deaths a week was average, and I was doing a funeral every 10 days on average. It is definitely tough. And it's tough in weird ways. As a chaplain, most of the funerals I did were for non-Christians because Christians tend to have relationships with some sort of local church or a local minister. So most of the time you're burying people who there is no clear evidence of faith. Now, and I say that because I'm not the judge and because I'm very aware that God moves and God brings people into a relationship with him outside of my knowledge, wisdom and insight, which is a wonderful thing. But so that's really challenging. It's also a wonderful opportunity, though, to minister in the midst of the tough stuff and minister not only to residents but to families and staff who are living in a really tough space. One of the big challenges for aged care generally, the staffing stuff is a big issue to start with, which is a funding issue. But the other challenge is that someone can go on their weekend, which may or may not be on a proper weekend, but have their 2 days off, and the resident who they've spent 18 months building a great relationship can die, and not only have died, but a new person be in their room and set up when you come back in. So you're then trying to be hi, how are you? Welcome to in the midst of trying to do that, well, but this is Bill's room, this is Bill's bed, I miss Bill. And that's really tough for anybody working in the aged care space.
Ben seems to wear a lot of different hats in his job, never knowing what one day will bring, as to be expected when people are nearing the end of their life. But I asked him what a regular daily routine is like for him.
There's not so much a thing as a regular day, to some extent, is part of the answer. And it depends a little bit on which organisation I've been working for. So there's some things that are normal and built into my week. So I'd normally be running at least one church service a week. You've also got funerals, which are semi-regular as part of that space. Lots of time just being with people, just the pastoral presence, prayer, those sort of skills. Also, you're trying to minister not simply to the residents, but to families and staff members. So that means that you're dealing with a whole range of pastoral issues, I'll call them, but that are not necessarily age-related. People whose husband or wife has had an affair, child abuse, all those other challenging spaces. And often, because of your very nature, you're linked to an aged care facility as opposed to a church. So most of the people you're working with and engaging with are not Christians. So you may be the only pastoral person that they know. So you will have conversations about a range of things that are both aged care specific, but often just general boring pain and suffering. So those things are important. You're trying to work closely with the lifestyle team. So they're the team in the facility who are running activities such as everything from painting, bingo, all those things. So I semi-regularly will be calling some bingo, or we had St. Patrick's Day last week and I was dancing, and I dance as well as I sing. So it's good for people to have something to laugh at. No 2 days are the same. It's probably a nice way of putting it.
And when I asked Ben if he loved his job, he had quite an interesting answer.
I regularly have people ask me, do I love my work? And my standard line is no, it's tiring, it's hard, it's exhausting. But I'm incredibly passionate about it. So, I wouldn't say that I love it, but I am overwhelmingly passionate about it, if that makes sense. I'd prefer to have a job that I was passionate about than a job that I loved. I love woodworking, but I'm passionate about aged care. So there's that differential. Part of that passion is God has made me that I'm a strong introvert, so I don't like people as a general rule, but I do love people, and particularly people who are not well cared for or not well appreciated, and people who are living with a few more years on the clock than others, and or people who are living with dementia are an incredibly important group of people who I think are incredibly neglected. In fact, I would argue they are the most discriminated against demographic in society.
Ben is right. There is no group more actively and systemically discriminated against than our ageing population. Part of that probably stems from a lack of understanding around dementia and how to relate to people with it. So I asked Ben what the common misconceptions were about the disease.
Dementia is an umbrella term. So much like cancer is an umbrella term. So if I was to say I have cancer, that can be true, but that doesn't tell you whether I have bowel cancer or skin cancer or a brain tumour or lymphatic cancer. And all of those things, they're all cancer, but they behave very differently, both in terms of symptoms, impact, and all those things. So in the same way, dementia is an umbrella term. The most common form of dementia, and it's about 70%, is Alzheimer's disease. But there is also vascular, pugilistic, all kinds of other types of dementia, and they all have their own different profile symptoms, and even like anything, just because someone has vascular dementia doesn't mean they'll be the same as the other person who has vascular dementia. So that's probably the first thing. The second general misunderstanding, I think, when we think about dementia, is that people think of dementia primarily as memory loss. Dementia really is breakdown of your brain, and your brain controls much more than simply your memory. Your brain controls your ability to navigate. So I'm one of those people who was never born with a very good internal map. If you ask me which way is east, I have to find out where the sun is or where a compass is, whereas my wife has a really great inbuilt sense of direction. But that ability, whether it's poor like mine or wonderful like my wife's, can be affected by dementia. So those things happen. Your ability to process is affected. Your ability to word find is affected. Your inhibitions are controlled by your brain. And I guess the third thing, and I should have said this before, is that dementia is a terminal condition. Dementia will kill you if something else doesn't first. So those three things are really important. A, dementia is an umbrella term for a number of different diseases. B, dementia affects much more than simply memory. And C, dementia is terminal.
However, despite all this, it's important to remember not to underestimate people with dementia, as Ben quickly learned in his job.
So when I first started working in the aged care space, I was working in a building with a dementia unit, and downstairs was the dementia unit, so it had a nice garden. You could walk outside and do a loop. And there was an older gentleman there who was a retired Baptist minister, if I recall rightly, and he spent most of his days walking, was almost totally nonverbal. You could get yes and no's out of him, but that was about it. And I remember I met him a few times, and I'm trying to learn and do all the right things, and I write, well, when you pray with someone with dementia, you want to be concrete and short. Okay, right. I know what I'm going to go and pray with. I'll call him Bill for the sake of the exercise. So the next time I saw Bill, can I pray with you? Yes. And I prayed this good dementia prayer. Lord, be with Bill, and may he know your peace and joy. Amen. Short, simple, concrete. And then he started to pray. And this man who normally struggled to put two words together prayed this beautiful, rich, deep prayer of faith. This prayer of someone who had been praying for so much longer and so much deeper than I think I'll ever pray. And it just flowed at him. And so that was a lovely example and a reminder that faith is impacted by dementia, just as our faith is impacted by whatever we go through, pain, suffering, being a radio presenter, all the challenges of life. Faith is impacted by, but it is not destroyed by any of those things either. So I think that's really important to remember. I guess the other half of that story is that I regularly see people living with dementia, and quite advanced dementia by the time I'm dealing with them, generally speaking, coming to faith. Now, generally, they are not going to be in a space that's going to be an overly cognitive example. I don't expect any of my residents to write 2,000-word essays on penal substitutionary atonement, but they often do come to a space of, I know Jesus and I love Jesus, and I may not even be able to articulate that in those words, but people who come to faith. And I think that's really important for us as Christians to remember, because I think at times we think old people are stuck in their ways. So either they've been a Christian for so many years that they obviously don't need us, their faith is so strong, or they've been hard to faith for so many years, so they obviously wouldn't come to faith, so we're not going to worry about spending time and engaging with them. And I think if we think that, we're wrong. Typically, your later period of life, you're facing the hardest challenges of your life. By the time you've hit 80, 90, you've realised that lots of the things that we treat as God-like, perhaps idolatrously, if I could use that terminology, in life, whether that's beauty, health, strength, wealth, all those things that society tells us are important. You don't see anybody in 85 on Love Island or anything like that. Once you've realised that those traditional idols are broken or unfulfilling, and you're very aware that you are going to be with God, face death at least, then you've got to come and recognise and wrestle with what is important. In fact, there's really good research that says that as people age, they become more interested in spirituality. Now, I use spirituality in the broadest generic sense as opposed to Christian spirituality, but that general openness to spirituality in terms of meaning, purpose and hope. If you can't see an opportunity to share the gospel when people are interested in meaning, purpose and hope, then you really need to think a bit harder.
Ben, you've also co-authored 2 books, just in your spare time, sure. Jesus Loves Me and Joy to the World. They're designed to share the Easter and Christmas stories with people living with dementia. What exactly what can I expect to find when I read this book? Like how do you manage to share the love of God with those maybe experiencing cognitive decline?
The books are built on a few things. We know that people living with dementia, even people living with quite advanced dementia, can still learn. So that's really important. We also know that dementia means that people, particularly advanced, means that people tend to have a shorter attention span. And the Christmas and the Easter story are powerful stories simply in terms of narrative. God loves you. God came. God lived, God died, and God was raised so you could have a relationship with God. How is that not a powerful narrative arc or story arc? And the current demographic, boomers and above, are a demographic where Sunday school or church attendance was normative. Many of those kids, their parents didn't go to church, but they were sent to Sunday school. So you're going back to memories from childhood, and typically old memories are stronger than new memories. So building on old is strong. Building on things like the classic hymns, Amazing Grace, and those things is powerful. So you're using powerful memory tools, powerful musical tools, powerful simple storytelling as well as image to try and effectively communicate. We know from the dementia research that those things work, and we've had some lovely feedback from both those books about people coming to faith through reading through them.
You've also written another book that you're currently looking for a publisher for. So if there's any publishers listening that might be interested, hit me up in the comments. It's called Jesus' Love in the Midst of Age and Dementia. What's it about?
It's an examination from both a theological and philosophical point of view about should we care for and why should we care for older people and people living with dementia, and then goes into some really practical things about how do we love people generally, what are some of the particular challenges of loving people who are dealing with older age and living with dementia, and then how do we share the gospel effectively, as well as some practical things around preaching, church services and all those things. So it's the sort of thing that if you're interested in caring for older people and you thought, yes, we do need to care for older people, how do we do that? It hits that mark. It's deliberately written to be quite easy to read. So while I think it will be helpful for people who are, I'll use the phrase clergy, but paid church workers, it's also eminently accessible and probably primarily aimed at the Joe Blow in the pews, if I can use that terminology.
Yeah, great. Well, what are the main tips that, the Joe Blows can take away for, caring for our own loved ones who may be aging?
I think the first thing is to care. And if we decide that we are going to care for those people, then we can start to work out what works for those people and how do we care for those people. Generally speaking, that's going to require prayer because that undergirds everything we do as Christians. It's going to be, generally speaking, relational. Now, how that works for different people is going to be very different, but it's very hard to have a relationship unless you're spending time with. Now, we've got the privilege of living in a time when we've got great technology tools where we can have a podcast with you in Sydney and me in Tamworth. So there are some great ways we can use intellectual technology and use that to be relational. But we've got to be doing something to actually engage with the people, to love them effectively. And then as Christians particularly, we want to be thinking about how do we how do we bring Jesus to bear in this situation in terms of affecting us, in terms of affecting our relationship with other people, and in terms of particularly caring for older people.
Dementia is often a scary, confronting situation,
Yes.
but one that many people deal with.
Yeah.
How do we go about talking about dementia more openly with each other so it doesn't seem like such a scary, confronting thing?
I think it's not so much the talking about. I think we actually need to start engaging with people. So it's not simply we need to watch our words, although that is really important, but that we need to be engaging with, and in doing so we will realise that yes, dementia is scary and yes, dementia is hard, but that people living with dementia still have purposeful, important lives. There is still joy in the midst of dementia. Now, it can be patches of joy, and there are some people who joy is really hard for in dementia and other things. Dementia is the biggest killer of women in Australia. That's just the facts. Yet I see lots of media attention, say, around domestic violence, which again disproportionately affects women. But I don't think we actually deal with or invest enough in caring for people with dementia. It's much more common to talk about abuse, and abuse is abhorrent, elder abuse, domestic violence, whatever. I'm not in any way trying to downplay that. But I think we do need to remember that dementia is the bigger killer, and therefore how are we going to care for particularly older women, because women tend to live longer than men in Australia. That's probably part of the reason. Heart disease is still the biggest killer of men in Australia. But so we need to be thinking about that in a medical terms, in a budgetary care terms, but also in a local church, individual Christian terms. How can I be engaging with the older people who are living in my community? If I don't have anybody living with dementia who I'm in regular contact with, what's going on there? Does that mean that I'm not caring, or does that mean that I've been busy and maybe I need to be making a point to contact someone or start a relationship with someone who's living with that space? We share God's love as Christians when we love people. And equally, if we fail to love people, how can people come to see God's love if God's people don't love them?
Wow. Oh, fantastic reminder. Ben, I have loved getting to chat to you. Final question. How have all these experiences, working in aged care, everything you've experienced throughout your life, how has it changed who you are as a person?
She says final question and then leave me something lovely and broad like that. At the moment, it's reminding me, and God's working on me, to remember that weakness is strength. So that's what God is poking me about at the moment, is reminding me that my functionality is not why he loves me. So that's huge. And aged care is a good reminder of that, in that, as I said, all the things that are very easy to see as important, strength, youth, power, etc., are gone when you're 93. You can be a quadruple billionaire and you're still in a room by yourself with 24 hours to kill and 12 of them without anything in there. I think living with death reminds us that death comes to us all, and suffering and death are universal. They're not gendered. They're not raced, if that makes sense. They're not any of those things. So that's really important. I feel like I'm growing, but I still have so much more to learn. So I don't know that I've answered the question very well, but that's as good as you're going to get at the moment.
Thank you so much to Ben Boland for sharing his story and passion for caring for the older people in our society. To purchase one of Ben's books, follow the link in the show notes. And if someone you love is dealing with dementia, there are lots of resources available at Dementia Australia, dementia.org.au, and that information also in the show notes. I'm Georgia, and thank you for listening to this episode of Finding Hope. I'd love to hear your feedback. You can send me an email, a review, or share it with your friends. Stories are always better when they're shared. And you never know what you can learn from someone else's journey. If you or someone you know has a story of hope to share and you'd like to be interviewed for the podcast, I would love to hear from you. You can leave a comment on the Finding Hope page at hopepodcasts.com.au. For now, I'll leave you with this verse. Even to your old age and grey hairs, I am He. I am He who will sustain you. I have made you and I will carry you. I will sustain you and I will rescue you. Isaiah 46, verse 4. Catch you next time.
This is a Hope 1032 production. Thanks for listening.